They called them witches. But the truth is far more unsettling. What if the women hunted, tortured, and erased during the Middle Ages were not victims of superstition, but targets of a deliberate system designed to control fear itself? And what if the most brutal acts committed against them never appeared in any official record because they were never meant to be known? Ask yourself this before we go any further. How many stories were buried so deep that even historians hesitate to unearth them? Today? This is where the truth begins, in the spaces between what was written and what was erased. Imagine a medieval village at night, a place where silence feels like a warning. In a world where a healed wound, a successful childbirth, or an unexplained recovery could be mistaken for sorcery. Women walked through life knowing they could be accused without evidence and punished without mercy. But those accusations were only the surface. The darkest acts happened before dawn, carried out in hidden chambers controlled by men who believed fear was a weapon more powerful than law. These were not simple trials. They were secret operations designed to break the human spirit before the public ever saw the flames. And what you are about to uncover goes far beyond the stories you learned in school. The first act, the one that set the pattern for everything that followed, involved isolation. Not the public jail, not the village stocks, but underground cells where time disappeared. Women were taken there before the accusations were even announced, kept in darkness so complete that their senses turned against them. Hours felt like days. Days felt like weeks. The mind began to invent horrors long before the interrogators arrived. This method was never recorded in court books because it was never meant to exist. It was psychological warfare disguised as religious duty, crafted to make any confession seem effortless once the questioning began. And here is the terrifying part. The EI system worked. By the time these women were brought into the public eye, they were already broken, shaped into the perfect image of guilt. Every tremble, every whisper, every hesitant breath was used as confirmation of sorcery. The authorities didn't search for truth. They manufactured it. They weaponized silence, darkness, and fear, turning each woman into a warning for everyone else. This is the part history tried to hide, the part that reveals how far medieval institutions were willing to go, when no one was watching. You ever felt that chilling sense that something important was left out of the past? Fica comigo até o final, because what you're about to discover may challenge everything you thought you knew. As you absorb this, I want you to think about your own reaction. Does any part of this story echo something you've experienced or questioned before? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, drop a like to support this kind of deep historical investigation, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Because the next revelation grows directly out of what we began here, and it's about to get even darker as we move forward into the second act of this hidden system. What happened after that first secret act was even more disturbing because it revealed how deeply the system relied on procedures that operated entirely outside the written laws. Once a woman emerged from the darkness of isolation, she wasn't truly returning to the world. She was entering a stage crafted to look like justice while masking something far more controlled. Medieval authorities had perfected a method that blurred the line between investigation and orchestration. Before any public accusation, a network of informants, midwives, tax collectors, traveling clerics, even neighbors coerced by fear, was already at work collecting rumors and fragments of behavior. These fragments were stitched together into a narrative that always pointed in one direction. The woman wasn't being examined. She was being prepared. What makes this stage so sinister is the precision with which it was executed. The interrogators didn't rely on evidence. They relied on patterns. A certain type of herb found in her home, a friendship with someone previously accused, the simple act of spending too much time alone or knowing more about healing than the men around her. any detail could be twisted into a sign of witchcraft. But the real core of this hidden system was the construction of a psychological funnel. Every question asked was designed to limit answers to two equally dangerous paths: admission or contradiction. Admission meant guilt. Contradiction meant deception, which was treated as further proof of guilt. Either way, she was already trapped. What few people understand is that these interrogations were rehearsed long before the accused woman ever saw her judges. Authorities studied confessions from previous trials, extracting phrases, gestures, and emotional reactions that had successfully broken others. They turned these into templates, using them as scripts to manipulate the accused into repeating the same patterns. Even the room where the interrogation took place was engineered to disorient. Cold stone walls, a single torch casting long shadows, the distant echo of chains or footsteps from another chamber. Every detail pushed the accused toward vulnerability, toward the moment when her voice began to falter and her thoughts felt unreliable. In these chambers, silence was a weapon as sharp as any blade. Interrogators would let minutes stretch into unbearable stillness, watching for signs of panic. A bowed head, a trembling hand, a glance at the floor could be interpreted as hesitation, and hesitation was taken as guilt. The woman's own body betrayed her. Her breathing, her posture, the way she answered the simplest question. Every reaction became a thread woven into a tapestry she had no control over. That was the point. The hidden objective of this phase wasn't to discover the truth. It was to reshape the accused into someone who looked guilty from the moment she stepped into the public trial. But beneath the surface of this carefully controlled environment was something even darker, a network of handlers who ensured the process remained invisible. These individuals operated between the shadows of religious authority and local governance. Their job was to decide which women would be targeted, which rumors would be amplified, and which accusations would be buried. They rarely appeared in records because their existence depended on secrecy. They moved quietly through villages, listening, collecting, and planting the seeds of suspicion long before the authorities arrived. Their presence created an atmosphere where any woman could be one whisper away from becoming the next target. By the time the accused faced her first formal questioning, she was already walking into a trap that had been designed long before she even knew she was a suspect. Her fate wasn't decided by the evidence she presented. It was shaped by a system that thrived on fear, control, and the ability to make anyone believe that guilt was inevitable. And as we move deeper into this hidden world, the next stage will reveal how confessions, so often cited as proof, were carefully engineered long before they were ever spoken aloud. By the time the accused woman reached the next stage, the machinery of the system had already shaped her path with frightening precision. What appeared to be a formal inquiry was nothing more than a ritual designed to extract the one thing authorities valued above all else: a confession that matched the narrative they had engineered from the beginning. This phase was the transformation of raw fear into spoken words, the moment when silence itself became too heavy to hold. Yet what most people never realize is that these confessions were not spontaneous, not revelations, not even admissions. They were manufactured echoes of what interrogators needed to hear, crafted through a mix of psychological pressure and orchestrated suggestion. Before any questions were asked aloud, the interrogators engaged in subtle tactics meant to erode the woman's sense of reality. They would describe details of alleged witchcraft she had never heard before, weaving them into casual remarks, insinuations, or half-finished sentences. They were planting images in her mind, images that would later feel like memories. Then came the rhythmic questioning, always returning to the same themes: nocturnal gatherings, forbidden herbs, secret pacts, healing practices mistaken for curses. The more these ideas were repeated, the more familiar they felt. Familiarity became plausibility, and plausibility became fear. This was the psychological alchemy at the heart of the system. What makes this stage especially chilling is how it relied on the human instinct to seek patterns. The accused wasn't simply responding to questions. She was trying to understand what the interrogators expected. Their expressions, shifts in tone, and moments of silence acted as invisible cues. A raised eyebrow when she hesitated. A slow nod when she mentioned a dream or vision. These subtle signals shaped her responses more effectively than threats ever could. Without realizing it, she began to mirror the narrative placed before her, trying to survive by aligning her words with the path she believed would lead to mercy. But mercy was never the goal. Compliance was. As hours passed, the weight of exhaustion and disorientation blurred the line between truth and invention. The human mind, under stress, fills empty spaces with imagination, and imagination becomes confession when guided by authority. This was the turning point. Interrogators would introduce an accusation and wait for the slightest flicker of agreement in her expression. Then they would seize upon it, repeating it back to her until it felt irrefutable. Each detail she accepted became a building block for the next. Soon, a full story emerged, not from memory, but from fear. And once that story began to take shape, the authorities documented it as though it had been voluntarily offered. The cruelty of this system is that it weaponized vulnerability. Women who tried to resist were accused of deception or possession. Women who broke down were accused of spiritual corruption. Women who attempted to remain silent were said to be using witchcraft to strengthen their resolve. Every reaction was interpreted as evidence of guilt. The interrogators didn't need facts, because the structure they had built ensured an endless supply of self-incrimination. And when the accused woman finally spoke a full confession, shaped by fatigue, persuasion, and coercion, it became the official truth, the justification for whatever punishment would follow. But behind the scenes, another layer of manipulation was taking place. Authorities compared each new confession to older ones, looking for phrases, ideas, or patterns that strengthened the overarching narrative of witchcraft within the region. They edited and expanded testimonies to align with the version of reality they needed the public to believe. These manipulated records were later used as evidence in other trials, creating a loop of fabricated proof that reinforced itself with each new victim. It was a system designed not only to destroy individuals, but to shape the collective memory of entire communities. By the end of this stage, the woman had been reshaped into the perfect symbol of guilt. But the most disturbing part was still to come, because once confession had been extracted, the authorities moved to a new level of psychological domination, one that operated deeper in the shadows, using tactics the public never saw and that history rarely acknowledged. Once the confession had been molded into the shape authorities desired, the process shifted into an even more concealed phase, one that rarely appeared in any written document because it exposed the true machinery behind medieval persecution. This stage was not about extracting words anymore. It was about dismantling identity. Interrogators understood that breaking a woman's mind would not only reinforce her supposed guilt, but also eliminate any chance that she might resist the narrative crafted for her. Everything that happened next was designed to erode selfhood, forcing her to internalize the accusations until they felt like fragments of her own thoughts. The setting of this phase was intentionally designed to confuse and destabilize. The accused was often moved to a different chamber, not the dark, suffocating cell of earlier stages, but one lit just enough to unsettle the senses. Shadows danced on the walls, creating shapes that played tricks on perception. Interrogators walked in and out without speaking, letting silence grow thick and heavy. This environment created a sense of suspension, a place where time seemed to stretch and where fear took on a life of its own. In such conditions, the mind became vulnerable to suggestion not through force, but through disorientation. But the most insidious tactic came in the form of rituals presented as acts of purification or spiritual cleansing. These rituals were neither public nor anchored in any official religious doctrine. They were invented, improvised, adjusted depending on the region or the preferences of the authorities involved. The woman might be forced to kneel for hours, her hands extended, her eyes fixed on a symbol she could barely see. She might be required to repeat sentences that blurred repentance with accusation, creating a psychological loop in which she became both the victim and the executioner of her own story. It was a tactic as cruel as any physical torment, because it corroded the inner sense of truth. Sometimes, faint chanting echoed through the chamber, performed by clerics who believed they were protecting the community from evil. Other times, the rituals unfolded in complete silence, broken only by the sound of the accused woman's unsteady breathing. Each variation served the same purpose: to isolate her from any remaining sense of self and to anchor her identity to the role the authorities had assigned. They weren't simply punishing her. They were rewriting her, turning her into a cautionary tale long before any punishment was carried out. Throughout this stage, interrogators carefully observed how the woman reacted to each imposed ritual. Did her posture weaken? Did her voice falter? Did her gaze drift downward? Every movement was interpreted as confirmation that the system was working. And if she resisted, if she questioned the ritual or showed signs of inner strength, the response was immediate and calculated. They would introduce new symbolic acts, new whispered phrases, new psychological burdens designed to wear her down until she no longer had the energy to resist. What made this part of the process especially devastating is that it wasn't intended merely to punish. It was intended to erase. By dismantling her sense of identity before any official judgment was made, authorities ensured that when she finally faced the public, she would not appear strong or defiant. She would appear defeated, resigned, and deeply marked by forces the community could not see. This visual transformation reinforced the belief that she had been consumed by something dark, something beyond human control. But beneath the ritualistic surface, the truth was far more human and far more tragic. These acts were not designed by divine mandate or ancient tradition. They were tools of power, crafted by men who understood how fear could be used to shape societies. And as these rituals hollowed out the women who endured them, they strengthened the authority of those who wielded them, cementing their control over communities that had no idea what happened behind closed doors. As this stage deepened, the boundary between fear and identity blurred, and the accused woman became a reflection of the system that tormented her. And now, as we move further into the hidden mechanics of medieval persecution, the next part reveals how those in power created structures meant to operate entirely outside human sight, ensuring that no voice, no memory, and no trace of resistance could survive. Before we continue, share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this hidden reality resonates with you or surprises you the most? As the hidden system advanced, the woman was no longer just an accused figure. She had become a moving piece within a structure that operated far beyond the reach of ordinary justice. What came next was the escalation of violence conducted not through public spectacle, but through quiet, controlled procedures that left almost no trace. Medieval authorities understood that the true power of persecution lay not only in punishment, but in the ability to manipulate what society believed was happening behind the scenes. And so, a parallel system emerged, one that operated outside the courts, outside the clergy, and outside any form of accountability. This system existed in cellars, abandoned storerooms, crypt corridors, and hidden annexes beneath administrative buildings. It was a world where rules dissolved and intentions grew darker. The purpose of this phase was not interrogation anymore. It was reinforcement. The authorities wanted to ensure that the confession extracted earlier would remain unshakable. Physical exhaustion and psychological collapse were powerful tools, but they could fade with time. Doubt could return. Memory could resurface. Resistance could quietly rebuild itself in the mind. To prevent this, they implemented a sequence of covert procedures intended to bind the accused woman's mind to the version of events they had crafted. This was not done with the violence people imagine when discussing witch hunts. Instead, it relied on a chilling combination of repetition, deprivation, and carefully controlled exposure to sensory extremes. In these hidden spaces, interrogators used alternating cycles of overstimulation and silence. At times, the woman would be forced to face blinding torchlight. At others, she would be left in near-total darkness. These cycles disrupted her internal rhythms, making it difficult for her to track the passage of time or understand whether minutes or hours had gone by. The more her perception fractured, the more vulnerable she became to external influence. That vulnerability was the goal. The system wanted her to lose her sense of continuity, to no longer trust her own thoughts, to feel suspended in a space where the only stable element was the narrative imposed on her. Another tactic often deployed during this stage involved orchestrated conversations that she was never meant to fully hear. Interrogators would speak just outside the chamber, whispering fragments of accusations or discussing supposed evidence that didn't exist. They did this knowing she would strain to catch every word, filling in the missing pieces with her worst fears. These fragments became powerful because they felt like confirmation of the narrative she had been forced to accept. Even more insidiously, the authorities sometimes mentioned names, neighbors, relatives, or friends, as potential accomplices. The goal was to create emotional conflict, guilt, or fear of implication, weakening her sense of connection to the outside world. As her psychological defenses deteriorated, physical weakness followed. The system understood that fatigue was not just a side effect, but a weapon. Meals became irregular, water was limited, sleep was interrupted by sudden noises or abrupt intrusions. The woman found herself drifting through states of consciousness that made it increasingly difficult to cling to any belief except the one she had been forced to repeat. Her identity shrank to the size of a single idea: that she had committed an offense she could no longer clearly define. The line between forced confession and internalized belief blurred until even she no longer knew where one ended and the other began. This stage also created a broader social purpose. By hiding these actions, authorities preserved the illusion of lawful procedure. The community saw only the final outcome: an accused woman exhausted, frightened, confessing publicly. They assumed the trial itself had brought her to that state, unaware of the secret machinery operating beneath the surface. This allowed the system to replicate itself across regions. Authorities shared techniques, occasionally traveling between towns to instruct others in methods too controversial to be written down. As these hidden practices spread, so did the unspoken understanding that no woman was ever truly safe once suspicion arose. By the end of this phase, the accused woman was not only isolated from her community, she was isolated from herself. Her thoughts no longer anchored her. Her memories drifted in and out of reach. What had been done in shadows now echoed inside her mind, shaping every response she would give when the final judgment approached. And as we push deeper into this concealed world, the next stage reveals how carefully the system ensured that even the faintest possibility of truth or resistance would be extinguished before the outside world ever witnessed her fate. By the time the authorities advanced into the next phase of their hidden system, the accused woman had already been reshaped into someone unrecognizable, not only to others, but to herself. Yet even this was not enough for those who orchestrated the machinery of persecution. They feared loose ends. They feared contradictions. They feared that someone, anyone, might later question how such confessions had been obtained. And so they developed a strategy that operated with chilling precision, the silent elimination of anything or anyone who might undermine the version of events they intended to present to the world. This was the stage where the system turned outward, reaching into the community with a subtle but devastating intent. The first layer of this strategy targeted information. Interrogators quietly destroyed or altered early notes taken during questioning, replacing them with revised versions that aligned better with the final confession. These revisions were crafted so carefully that even officials who believed they were following lawful procedure rarely suspected that the early drafts had ever been different. In many cases, the initial notes were burned, buried, or mixed with unrelated documents stored in inaccessible archives. The goal was to ensure that no record existed that might expose inconsistencies or reveal the psychological manipulation used to break the accused. But the authorities knew that documents were only part of the problem. People carried memories, and memories could be dangerous. Anyone who had interacted with the accused before her confession, neighbors who had seen her taken away, individuals who had heard the early stages of questioning, even guards who perceived too much, became potential risks. To manage this, the system employed a network of handlers whose job was to reshape or suppress these memories. They spread alternative narratives, implying that the accused had resisted violently, had cursed the interrogators, or had shown signs of possession. These invented stories circulated quietly at first, then grew louder as they spread through the village. Over time, they replaced the truth with something more sensational, something that made the authorities' actions appear justified. At the same time, subtle pressure was applied to anyone who seemed uncertain or sympathetic. A neighbor who hesitated when questioned might suddenly find herself monitored. A guard who expressed discomfort with what he had witnessed could be replaced or transferred. Conversations were overheard, recorded mentally, used to identify potential dissidents. In more severe cases, individuals who posed a threat to the narrative suffered sudden misfortune, a ruined crop, a damaged reputation, a quiet accusation of their own. These retaliatory actions were usually small, but they were enough to silence doubts and discourage anyone from challenging the official account. Another tactic involved redirecting the community's attention. Authorities would amplify minor disturbances, an unexplained illness, a dispute between families, a poor harvest, and subtly imply that these events were connected to witchcraft or divine punishment. The aim was to anchor the community's emotions to fear rather than inquiry. When fear controlled the narrative, people became more willing to accept extreme measures. The accused woman's case became a symbol, a cautionary tale that discouraged further questioning. This process did not require brute force. It required careful storytelling, strategic omissions, and the manipulation of belief. In religious settings, priests reinforced these narratives through sermons, urging the congregation to remain vigilant against hidden evil. These sermons rarely mentioned the accused directly, but their timing was purposeful. Delivered soon after confessions were finalized, they shaped the moral atmosphere in ways that aligned perfectly with the authorities' goals. Villagers who might have otherwise sympathized with the accused found themselves reconsidering, uneasy with the possibility that defending her could invite suspicion upon themselves. Meanwhile, the accused woman, still confined in secret chambers, had no idea how her name was being transformed outside those walls. She didn't know that her neighbors were already whispering stories she had never spoken, or that her fate had been sealed long before she would emerge for the public trial. The system had constructed a world in which nothing she said, felt, or remembered could protect her. Every path led to the same destination, and all of it was hidden beneath a veneer of religious duty and legal procedure. By the end of this stage, the authorities had not only shaped the woman's internal reality, but had also engineered the external world to reflect the narrative they needed. Her identity, her history, her relationships, all had been rewritten in silence. And as we descend further into this concealed machinery, the next stage reveals the punishment designed not to kill the accused, but to erase whatever fragments of her spirit remained, sealing her fate long before the public ever witnessed her final downfall. As the machinery of persecution moved into its next hidden phase, the authorities focused on women who managed to survive the earlier stages of psychological and physical domination. Survival did not mean safety. In fact, it often triggered an even more insidious process, one designed to ensure that any woman who endured the secret interrogations would emerge so shattered that she could never regain her place in society. This stage wasn't about extracting information, nor was it about preparing her for public trial. It was about destroying the remnants of her identity in a way that appeared invisible to outsiders, a punishment carried out in silence long before the community ever saw her again. This began with something deceptively simple: forced solitude. Not the dark, suffocating isolation of the earlier phases, but a colder, quieter confinement meant to mimic freedom while denying its essence. She was allowed to walk within a restricted corridor, to see faint light through small openings, to hear distant sounds of life she could not reach. The illusion of proximity became its own torment. This structured solitude was carefully calculated to weaken her bonds with the outside world. Every footstep she heard, every murmur, from beyond the walls, reminded her of a life she was no longer part of. This psychological distance deepened the fracture already carved inside her mind. Then came the punishments that left no visible marks yet struck at the core of her identity. She might be forced to perform repetitive tasks for hours, meaningless actions designed solely to erode her sense of purpose. She might be required to recite phrases of repentance that contradicted her memories, forcing her to repeat words that reshaped her understanding of herself. These acts did not bruise the body, but they bruised something far deeper. Over time, the repetition became automatic, draining her of the last fragments of defiance or self-recognition. The system also weaponized uncertainty. Her routines were deliberately disrupted, meals arriving at unpredictable times, guards switching shifts without explanation, periods of silence followed by sudden noise. This instability prevented her from forming any internal structure, leaving her mentally adrift. Sleep became fragmented, rest became incomplete, and even brief moments of calm were overshadowed by the fear of what might come next. The authorities understood that exhaustion did not need to be inflicted through violence. It could be cultivated through unpredictability. Another devastating tactic was the controlled reintroduction of sensory triggers. Interrogators would bring her objects or scents from her former life: a scrap of cloth, a familiar herb, the faint sound of children playing outside. These triggers were meant to stir memories, but always in ways that caused pain rather than comfort. Each reminder underscored the distance between who she had been and who she had become. The past no longer felt like a place she could return to. It became a source of grief that hollowed her from within. Perhaps the harshest element of this stage was the creation of shame. Authorities understood that public humiliation was unnecessary if they could plant the seed internally. Whispered accusations, insinuations about her morality, implications that she had brought misfortune upon others. These were delivered by guards, clerics, or handlers in quiet moments. They were not official charges. They were psychological weapons meant to convince her that she was unworthy, tainted, or broken. By the time she was brought before the public, she carried that shame like a second skin, influencing every gesture and every word. This invisible punishment served a broader purpose. When the community finally saw her, weakened and hollowed, they interpreted her condition as confirmation of guilt. They assumed the darkness in her eyes reflected the evil they had been taught to fear. They didn't know that her transformation was engineered, not by demonic forces, but by the very system claiming to protect them. By the end of this stage, the woman had not only been accused and broken, she had been redefined. She no longer belonged to the world she once knew, and she no longer recognized herself within it. And as the hidden system prepared for its next move, her fate was sealed in ways she could no longer fight. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this hidden transformation do you think left the deepest mark on those who endured it? By the time the system advanced to the next layer of its hidden process, the woman was no longer simply a target of accusation. She had become a vessel shaped entirely by the forces that sought to destroy her. Yet even this level of psychological devastation was not enough for the authorities. They needed something more concrete, something they could present to the public as irrefutable evidence of her guilt. And so they turned to the tools of medieval pain, devices and mechanisms designed not merely to wound, but to manipulate perception, confessions, and public belief. What many people misunderstand today is that these instruments were not always used in their most brutal form. Often, their true power lay in the threat, the symbolism, and the subtle, quiet demonstrations carried out just beyond the woman's control. These devices were kept in hidden rooms, not displayed openly except during public executions or dramatic trials. Most were small, simple constructions of iron, wood, leather, or rope. Yet each carried a specific purpose: to create discomfort without leaving marks, to pressure joints without causing fractures, to produce pain that faded quickly but lingered. In memory, interrogators used them strategically, not as weapons but as psychological anchors. The accused woman might be shown the tools, allowed to hear the creak of wood or the clink of metal. She might feel the pressure of a restraint applied gently, just enough to trigger fear. The goal was not to torture her into confession. That had already been achieved. The goal was to ensure she internalized the belief that she had committed monstrous acts deserving of such devices. This ritualized exposure served another purpose as well. It allowed interrogators to manipulate the narrative of guilt in increasingly elaborate ways. For example, if the woman flinched when shown a certain tool, it could be interpreted as a sign that she had previously used similar instruments in forbidden rituals. If she failed to respond, it could be presented as evidence of supernatural resistance. No reaction could truly protect her, because every gesture became another thread woven into the story being built around her. The system did not seek truth. It sought validation of its own design, and these tools offered the perfect stage for that validation. Some of the devices were used in more direct ways, but never at the intensity later associated with witch trials. Instead, interrogators applied controlled pressure, tightening bindings just enough to restrict blood flow, placing weight on certain points to create temporary numbness, or manipulating posture to induce discomfort. These methods were subtle, often lasting mere minutes. Yet in those minutes, the woman's mind raced with fear, imagining far worse possibilities. The body reacted with trembling, cold sweats or involuntary spasms, and these reactions were recorded meticulously by the authorities. They would later describe these symptoms as signs of possession, evidence that the woman harbored dark forces within her. Another tactic involved sensory manipulation. Authorities used heated metal that never actually made contact with the skin, but generated enough warmth and scent to terrify the accused. They used ropes pulled taut near her legs or arms, never tearing flesh but stretching the imagination. They also used silence as a counterweight, long moments in which the woman sat restrained while nothing happened at all. The absence of action became its own form of torment, because the anticipation of pain can be more damaging than pain itself. This was the psychological sophistication of the system. It relied on the mind to complete what the instruments merely suggested. These practices were rarely documented because they blurred the line between interrogation and performance. The authorities did not want future generations, or even their contemporaries, to understand how calculated the process truly was. Instead, they allowed myths and rumors to fill in the gaps, letting the community imagine horrors far worse than what actually occurred. Ironically, this distortion served them well. The public believed witches endured terrible torments because they were dangerous. The truth was that the system inflicted just enough suffering to maintain fear while preserving plausible deniability. By the time this stage concluded, the tools of pain had fulfilled their purpose. The woman was left not with visible injuries, but with memories engineered to reinforce her assigned identity. Her mind held the echo of pressure, the shadow of pain, the weight of devices she never fully understood. And as the hidden process continued to unfold, the authorities prepared her for the next transformation, one in which belief, fear, and manipulated memory converged into the narrative the public was meant to accept without question. As the system advanced into its next concealed phase, the accused woman found herself trapped in a reality no longer shaped solely by interrogators, but by forces far more pervasive, the religious frameworks that governed medieval life. This stage did not involve tools, chambers, or secret handlers. Instead, it unfolded through doctrine, symbolism, and the vast power of belief. It was here that the persecution reached its most refined form, because it blended divine authority with human manipulation so seamlessly that even those enforcing the rituals believed they were acting in service of a higher cause. The woman, already weakened, entered a realm where every word spoken over her, every gesture made around her, carried the weight of spiritual judgment. What made this phase particularly devastating was the deliberate merger of theology with fear. Priests and clerics were instructed to reinterpret the woman's behavior through a religious lens, transforming ordinary reactions into signs of spiritual corruption. A trembling hand could be labeled as a manifestation of demonic influence. Tears could be described as resistance to holy truth. Even silence, once seen as submission, became evidence of a hidden pact. These interpretations were not questioned because they aligned with the prevailing belief that evil could hide behind any gesture. The community, conditioned by sermons and scripture, trusted their clergy without hesitation, and the clergy trusted the authorities who had fed them a manipulated version of the woman's story. This alignment created a powerful psychological trap. The accused woman was confronted with religious figures who genuinely believed she carried darkness within her. Their conviction added force to their words, making their accusations feel absolute. When a priest spoke of cleansing or repentance, he did so with an earnestness that made resistance feel not only futile, but sinful. The woman, already stripped of identity and weakened by isolation, struggled to differentiate between institutional manipulation and spiritual truth. Her mind, disoriented and exhausted, grasped for stability, and the only stability offered was submission to the narrative imposed upon her. Religious rituals played a central role in this phase. Some were improvised, others borrowed from existing practices, but all were repurposed to reinforce the idea of guilt. Holy water might be sprinkled not as a blessing, but as a test, any involuntary reaction interpreted as fear of purity. Scriptures might be read aloud in voices that echoed through the chamber, emphasizing passages about sin, temptation, or divine punishment. Objects considered sacred were placed near the accused, not to comfort, but to provoke discomfort, suggesting that her spirit recoiled from holiness. These rituals, repeated day after day, blurred the boundaries between imposed judgment and internalized belief. Another manipulative tactic involved staged revelations. Clerics would claim to sense spiritual disturbances whenever the accused entered the room, asserting that her presence brought a heaviness or chill. They described shadows moving, candles flickering, or faint whispers during prayers. These fabrications were subtle but effective, reinforcing the idea that she carried an unseen corruption. Even if she recognized these claims as false, her weakened mind struggled to resist the growing pressure. Over time, she began to doubt herself. Perhaps she had unknowingly offended the divine. Perhaps the darkness others claimed to see was real. This internal conflict made her even more vulnerable to the next suggestion, the next ritual, the next whispered judgment. Meanwhile, The community outside the chamber absorbed similar messages. Priests delivered sermons that warned of subtle evil infiltrating homes and hearts. They spoke of temptations disguised as ordinary actions, encouraging the faithful to remain vigilant. Though they avoided mentioning the accused woman directly, everyone understood the implication. Fear spread through the village not because of visible threats, but because religious authority had declared the presence of hidden danger. This collective anxiety created an atmosphere where no one questioned the accusations. Instead, they saw themselves as protectors of divine order, even as they unknowingly participated in the destruction of an innocent life. By this stage, the woman's identity had been eroded to the point where she no longer knew whether she was resisting injustice or resisting divine truth. The line between imposed guilt and spiritual condemnation blurred until both felt indistinguishable. Her memories, fractured by psychological manipulation, now intertwined with religious fears, instilled by those meant to guide her. And as the system prepared for its final act, she stood on the precipice of a fate shaped not by the evidence of her life, but by a narrative engineered through fear, faith, and absolute authority. By the time the final phase of the hidden system unfolded, the accused woman had been stripped of everything that once defined her: her identity, her memories, her reputation, even her understanding of reality itself. What happened next was not merely the conclusion of her persecution, but the culmination of a carefully engineered process designed to ensure that every trace of her humanity vanished beneath the weight of the narrative imposed upon her. This stage was not about justice, nor about punishment. It was about transformation, turning an ordinary woman into the embodiment of a warning, a symbol meant to reinforce fear across an entire community. The transition into this final act began quietly. Authorities prepared her for public presentation, not with physical force, but with manipulation of perception. She was given garments that emphasized frailty, colors that drew attention to pallor, and positions in which she would appear smaller, weaker, more shadowed by something unseen. These details were not accidental. They were chosen to shape how the community would interpret her condition. When she stepped into the light for the first time after her long confinement, her appearance alone told a story the authorities needed: people to believe that she had been touched by darkness, marked by forces beyond human comprehension. Yet the most powerful component of this stage was not her appearance, but the script prepared around her. Officials rehearsed the sequence of events, ensuring that every statement, gesture, and pause aligned with the narrative cultivated over weeks of hidden manipulation. Clerics stood nearby, ready to offer solemn declarations about spiritual corruption. Witnesses, many pressured or conditioned, confirmed stories that had never existed. Even the crowd, already primed by sermons and rumors, arrived in a state of heightened anticipation, eager to glimpse what they had been told was a vessel of danger. The atmosphere was electric with fear disguised as piety. The woman, weakened and disoriented, could hardly distinguish between what she had endured and what she was now being told she had done. When officials presented her confession, edited, expanded, manipulated, it echoed phrases she barely remembered speaking. She felt trapped in a reflection of herself that she could not escape, a version engineered by others and now accepted as truth by everyone around her. Her silence, her trembling, her hollowed expression, all reinforced the belief that she was no longer fully human, that something inside her had been overtaken by the forces she was accused of serving. This was the moment when the system achieved its ultimate purpose. Not through execution, nor through imprisonment, but through the creation of a lasting myth. The woman's fate, whatever form it took, banishment, death, or disappearance, became secondary. What mattered was the story the community carried forward: that evil could be hidden within anyone, that vigilance was necessary, and that the authorities alone could interpret the signs. Her erasure ensured that the machinery of fear would continue functioning long after she was gone. Villagers whispered her name with trembling reverence, mothers warned their daughters, and clerics used her memory to strengthen their sermons. A single life had been consumed to feed a narrative capable of outlasting generations. As the final act closed, the woman's existence dissolved into a legend shaped by those who had orchestrated her downfall. The truth of her suffering remained locked behind walls, buried in notes that no longer matched reality, carried only in the memories of those too afraid to speak. And yet, her story reflects the broader tragedy of medieval persecution, a system that thrived not on evidence or justice, but on fear, manipulation, and the relentless desire for control. If you stayed with this story until the end, your presence here already shows how deeply these hidden histories still resonate. If this journey through what was never meant to be revealed brought you insight or reflection, consider subscribing so you can explore more truths that history tried to hide. Leave a comment saying something like, "I'm with you until the end," or whatever phrase feels true to you. And let your voice mark your presence in this conversation. And if this narrative stirred something in you, a simple like helps keep these stories alive. There's another video just beside this one that continues uncovering the shadows of the past. Click it and keep walking with me through the history the world forgot.